World of Warcraft has spent 20 years creating some of the most iconic classes in gaming, but for every legendary spec that dominated raids or arenas, there was another that players genuinely dreaded seeing in their group finder. Specs ruined by broken mechanics, identity crises, disastrous redesigns, or balancing so bad they became memes across the entire community. Today we're breaking down the worst classes in WoW history, from specs Blizzard couldn't fix to ones players refused to touch no matter how many patches tried to save them. And we're starting with one that proves good intentions mean absolutely nothing. Dragonflight Affliction, Warlock. Here's the thing about Affliction Warlock in Dragonflight. It wasn't bad because the numbers were wrong. It was bad because the entire talent tree was architecturally broken and no amount of number tweaking was ever going to fix it. The new talent system forced Affliction players into an impossible choice. You could build for single target damage or you could build for AoE damage, but you could never do both. There simply weren't enough talent points to cover both profiles within the same build, which sounds like a minor inconvenience until you remember that every single piece of endgame content in WoW requires you to handle both. Mythic Plus needs AoE, raid bosses need single target. Affliction said pick one and suffer, and then Unstable Affliction came back. Players were genuinely excited. A signature ability returning to the spec felt like a step in the right direction, but Unstable Affliction demanded its own talent point investment to function properly, which meant even fewer points for solving the core problem. The thing everyone was hyped about actually made the situation worse, which is, not ideal. Blizzard tried to patch it. Patch 10.0.5 buffed Rapture by 15%, adjusted a handful of talent values, and the community mathed it out to roughly a 6% overall damage increase. 6% on a spec where the problem wasn't damage output, but the fact that your talent tree physically couldn't build a functional kit. That's like putting a fresh coat of paint on a house with no foundation and calling it renovated. The real irony is what Affliction represented. Dragonflight's talent overhaul was marketed as giving players more agency, more meaningful decisions, and Affliction became the poster child for the exact opposite. You weren't picking talents. You were solving a constraint equation with no correct answer, but at least Affliction's problems were architectural, clean, fixable in theory. The next entry didn't get that luxury because Blizzard decided to take an entire spec and turn it into something its own players didn't recognize. Shadowlands Survival Hunter. Survival Hunter is the spec that nobody can explain. And I don't mean players, I mean the developers, the people who made it. If you asked 10 different Blizzard designers what Survival Hunter was supposed to feel like in Shadowlands, you'd get 11 different answers and none of them would be convincing. Here's the thing. Back in Legion, Blizzard made the bold decision to convert survival from a range spec into a melee spec. A hunter in melee range stabbing things with a stick, which is, not ideal for a class whose entire fantasy revolves around standing far away and shooting stuff, but fine. New direction. Fresh start. Except by Shadowlands, Survival had spent multiple expansions trying to figure out what it actually was, and it still hadn't landed on an answer. The rotation demanded precise positioning. You had to manage trap placement timing, juggle cooldowns, weave in explosives and weapon strikes in this very specific sequence that required genuine mechanical effort, and then your reward for executing all of that correctly was mid damage. Just okay numbers, nothing that made you go, yes, this is why I'm standing in melee range getting punched in the face instead of shooting from safety like every other hunter spec. But here's where it gets weird. Survival wasn't even bad in the traditional sense. The numbers weren't catastrophically low. It could technically clear content. The problem was philosophical. The spec had zero identity. Beast Mastery had pets. Marksmanship had precision. Survival had traps, bombs, a pointy stick, some combination of all three that never committed to any of them. The community response was brutal but predictable. Raid leaders saw Survival Hunter in the group finder and said the same thing every single time. Can you go BM? That was the conversation. You could be the best Survival Hunter on your server and it didn't matter because the spec carried the reputation of being the wrong choice, not the weak choice, the wrong one. Blizzard tried fixing it. Multiple patch cycles, adjusted cooldowns, tweaked damage numbers, shuffled abilities around. None of it worked because none of it addressed the actual problem. You can't buff your way out of an identity crisis. Survival Hunter didn't need 15% more damage on Raptor Strike, it needed someone at Blizzard to answer one simple question. What is this spec supposed to feel like? For the entirety of Shadowlands, that question went unanswered. But if Survival Hunter's problem was not knowing what it was, the next spec on our list had the opposite issue. It knew exactly what it was, it just couldn't stay alive long enough for anyone to notice. Battle for Azeroth Enhancement. Shaman entered Battle for Azeroth as genuinely exciting, and I don't say that lightly because most specs enter a new expansion with the community already writing their obituary. Enhancement actually showed up on early tier lists as a viable melee DPS option. People were optimistic, people were theory crafting, people were having fun. That lasted about 5 minutes. Here's where it gets complicated. Blizzard looked at Enhancement's initial performance numbers and apparently decided the spec was so overtuned that it needed an emergency aura, reducing all Enhancement Shaman damage by 43%. Not a specific ability, not a single interaction. Everything. Every single point of damage you dealt was nearly cut in half through a blanket modifier. Either the spec was genuinely doing almost double the damage it should have been, or someone at Blizzard typed the wrong number into a spreadsheet and hit save. Neither option is great, but wait, it gets worse. When the developers eventually realized that slapping a 43% damage reduction aura on an entire specialization was, not a sustainable balance strategy, they decided to remove the aura. Cool, problem solved, right? No, because to compensate, they went through and reduced individual ability numbers instead. Lightning Ball's damage with overcharge got cut in half, Rockbiter was slashed, they essentially took the same nerf and distributed it across every ability like some kind of horrible damage reduction buffet. Here's your nerf, and here's your nerf. Everybody gets a nerf. The result was a spec that had been murdered twice. Once by the aura, and once by the surgical removal of the aura, followed by equally aggressive individual nerfs. Enhancement went from a spec people were excited to play to either the worst melee specialization in the game or in the running for it. Below Death Knights, below Warriors, below Rogues, Feral Druids, Demon Hunters, Survival Hunters, Monks, and even Paladins. That's not a tier list placement, that's a restraining order, and the worst part, guides became completely useless. The constant adjustments meant that any rotation advice or damage optimization strategy you found online was outdated within weeks. You'd follow a guide perfectly and discover that 3 of the abilities you were prioritizing had been nerfed into the ground 2 patches ago. The ground was shifting so fast that nobody could build anything stable on it. Enhancement Shaman in Battle for Azeroth wasn't killed by bad design, it was killed by panic. Blizzard overcorrected so hard and so fast that the spec never had a chance to find its footing. They saw a problem, hit it with a sledgehammer, then hit the rubble with a second sledgehammer, just to be safe. But at least Enhancement's problems were straightforward. Outlaw Rogue's Nightmare was built directly into the spec's DNA, Legend Outlaw Rogue. Blizzard looked at the Rogue class, a class literally built on precision, timing, and punishing mistakes, and said, what if we added a slot machine? And somehow nobody in the room said no. When Legion launched, Combat Rogue got a full rebrand into Outlaw Rogue, complete with a pirate aesthetic and a brand new core ability called Roll the Bones. Here's how it worked. You press the button, you get a random buff. Sometimes you get Broadside or True Bearing or Shark-Infested Waters and your damage skyrockets. Sometimes you get Grand Melee, which is the buff equivalent of finding a penny on the ground, not even heads up. The problem wasn't that Roll the Bones existed, the problem was that it sat at the absolute center of your damage output. 2 Outlaw Rogues could walk into the same raid, wearing identical gear, executing the exact same rotation with the exact same timing, and one of them would parse 30% higher than the other because they got luckier rolls. That's it. That's the whole difference. One guy hit the jackpot and one guy didn't, and the damage meters treated them accordingly. The community labeled Roll the Bones an anti-skill spell, which is about the most damning thing you can call an ability in a game where people spend hundreds of hours optimizing rotations down to the millisecond. You could maintain perfect uptime on every ability, manage your energy flawlessly, position yourself like a surgeon, and still lose on the meters to some guy who just learned what slice and dice does, but happened to roll broadside 3 times in a row. It was cool. Love that for everyone involved. Now, Blizzard did try to mitigate this, like saber/proc mechanics and various talent adjustments gave players slightly more influence over their roles. You could build around Roll the Bones in ways changes that reduce the variance. But here's the thing, reducing the variance of a fundamentally random system doesn't make it not random. It just makes it slightly less random. The core issue was never the randomness is too swingy. The core issue was, why is there mandatory gambling in my rotation at all? This wasn't a numbers problem, this was a philosophy problem. Rogues have always been the class where mechanical skill separates the good from the great. Every combo point matters, every cooldown window matters, every global cooldown matters, and then Blizzard dropped a dice roll into the middle of that and said, also, this matters more than all of it. It's like training for the Olympics and then finding out the judges are flipping coins. Dedicated rogue players genuinely debated abandoning Outlaw entirely, not because the spec was weak, not because the rotation was boring, because it was psychologically maddening to play perfectly and still get punished by math. Assassination and Subtlety didn't have this problem. They rewarded you for playing well. Outlaw rewarded you for being lucky, which is not the same thing no matter how many talent adjustments you bolt onto the side. But if Roll the Bones offended people on principle, wait until you hear about the spec Blizzard gave Warriors and then ripped away entirely. Warlords of Draenor Gladiator Stance Warrior. Gladiator Stance was genuinely one of the coolest ideas Blizzard ever had for Warriors. A sword and shield DPS spec. You grab your protection gear, flip on Gladiator Stance, and suddenly you're not tanking anymore. You're dealing competitive damage while being significantly harder to kill than any Arms or Fury warrior in the raid. You could flex into tanking if someone disconnected. You had defensive cooldowns that actual DPS specs could only dream about. On paper, this was brilliant, and for about 5 minutes in Warlords of Draenor, it actually worked. Here's the thing, Gladiator Stance launched slightly overtuned relative to Arms and Fury, mostly because both of those specs had eaten massive nerfs during the pre-patch. So early Warlords players saw Protection Warriors in Gladiator Stance topping damage meters while basically being unkillable, and they thought this was the future of the class. A third viable DPS path that rewarded you for thinking differently about what a warrior could be. But the numbers normalized, and the moment they did, Gladiator Stance ran face first into a wall that no amount of tuning could fix: the social structure of the game itself. See, WoW operates on a rigid trinity: tank, healer, DPS. Every group finder listing, every raid roster, every dungeon composition is built around those three categories. Gladiator Stance didn't fit any of them. You queued as DPS, but you were wearing tank gear. You dealt less damage than Arms. You dealt less damage than Fury. You were tougher than both, sure, but nobody was asking their DPS to be tough. They were asking their DPS to do damage. So you'd apply to groups and immediately get hit with the same two questions every single time. Why don't you just go Arms? Or if you have tank gear, why aren't you tanking? There was no third option in anyone's mind. You were either a tank or a DPS, and Gladiator Stance's entire identity was being neither, which meant being nothing. The spec occupied the worst possible design space, a double compromise. Worse tank than actual protection, worse DPS than Arms or Fury. It didn't matter that the survivability was genuinely useful in progression content. It didn't matter that the flexibility was exactly what smaller guilds needed. The community had already decided what warriors were supposed to do, and shield DPS wasn't on the list. By the final content tier of Warlords, Gladiator Stance had essentially vanished, not because the numbers were terrible, not because the rotation was boring. It disappeared because two other warrior specs did roughly similar damage without the constant identity crisis and group finder rejection. Why fight for acceptance when you could just equip a two-hander and never explain yourself again? And that's the tragedy of it. Gladiator Stance wasn't killed by bad design, it was killed by a community that enforces the tank, healer, DPS trinity so rigidly that even the developers couldn't break it. Blizzard tried to give warriors something genuinely new, and the player base collectively said, no thanks, put it back. It never returned, which is, not ideal. But if Gladiator Stance died because WoW's community refused to accept it, the next spec on this list died because its own abilities refused to work. Mists of Pandaria, Windwalker Monk launch. Imagine your Blizzard Entertainment. You've spent years developing an entirely new class from scratch. New animations, new lore, new mechanics, new everything. Monks are the headline feature of Mists of Pandaria. This is your big moment. You ship it, and then a few patches in, the signature ability of the DPS spec just doesn't work. Not undertuned, not needs a balance pass. Literally doesn't function. Storm, Earth, and Fire was introduced in patch 5.2 as the coolest thing about Windwalker Monk. You press the button, your character splits into elemental spirit duplicates, and those spirits are supposed to mirror your attacks on other targets. It's flashy, it's thematic, it's the entire identity of the spec. The spirits should copy what you do, splitting your damage across multiple enemies. Simple enough, except the spirits would spawn, swing at something briefly, and then just vanish into thin air. Gone. No damage, no explanation, just a monk standing there wondering where his elemental clones went. This is the equivalent of launching a new car and forgetting to connect the engine to the wheels. Yeah, it looks great in the driveway though. Here's the thing, this wasn't some niche interaction or an edge case that only showed up in specific raid encounters. This was the core damage mechanic of the entire specialization. Every Windwalker monk who pressed their signature button got the same result. Nothing. So the ability was animated, had sound effects, and simply did not do what it was supposed to do. That's not a balance issue. That's a programming failure shipping on a retail product. And you'd think something this broken would get an emergency hotfix within days. Turns out, no. Blizzard took an extended period to fully resolve the ability. Not a quick patch, not a we're aware, and here's a temporary fix. Just weeks of Windwalker monks existing as a spec missing its primary damage tool, while Blizzard worked on making the ability do the one thing it was designed to do. The damage to the spec's reputation was immediate and lasting. Even after Storm, Earth, and Fire eventually got fixed, group leaders treated Windwalker monks like ticking time bombs. Nobody wanted to invite the spec whose defining ability shipped broken, because who knew what else might suddenly stop working mid-pull. You could be perfectly geared, perfectly skilled, and still get declined because raid leaders had trust issues with your entire class. But here's the punchline. When Mists of Pandaria Classic launched over a decade later, Storm, Earth, and Fire was broken again. The same bug, the same ability, the same disappearing spirits, more than 10 years of development, an entire classic re-release, and nobody caught that the spec's signature move still didn't work. Players posted about it immediately, pointing out that the ability was broken just like it was in original MOP, which is not exactly the kind of nostalgia people were hoping for. At least Windwalker's problems were eventually fixable. The next spec on this list had issues that went way deeper than a bugged ability. Cataclysm Subtlety Rogue. Subtlety Rogue went into surgery in Cataclysm and woke up as a completely different person. Nobody asked for this. Nobody wanted this, but Blizzard did it anyway, and the result was a spec that looked at traditional rogue gameplay, said no thank you, and decided to become a stealth-based performance art piece instead. Here's what happened. The Cataclysm redesign made Sinister Calling a baseline talent, which bumped the agility boost to 15% and pushed damage increases to backstab and hemorrhage up to 40%. On paper, that sounds like a buff. In practice, it fundamentally reshaped what subtlety was supposed to do and how you were supposed to do it. The spec you knew was gone. In its place was something that required you to read a spreadsheet before entering combat. Maybe 2 spreadsheets, depending on your gear. Master of Subtlety became a baseline passive, giving you 10% extra damage while stealthed and for 6 seconds after breaking stealth. Which sounds straightforward until you realize the optimal way to play subtlety was now stealth dancing. You'd sneak into stealth mid-combat, pop out for your buffed damage window, then sneak back in and do it again, over and over, during a boss fight. While your raid leader is calling mechanics and everyone else is just pressing their buttons like normal human beings, you looked like a rogue having a panic attack, just flickering in and out of existence while the rest of your group stood there hitting things in a way that made visual sense. Then they added the Executioner Mastery system on top of all that. 20% bonus finisher damage plus 2.5% per mastery point. So now you're tracking your Master of Subtlety buff timer, managing your stealth dance windows, calculating mastery scaling on your finishers, and trying not to have a stroke. The mathematical complexity felt completely alien to anyone who'd played Subtlety before Cataclysm. This wasn't an evolution, this was a full organ transplant, and the body was rejecting it. And the worst part, even when Subtlety actually hit competitive damage numbers nobody cared, the redesigned experiment reputation stuck to it like glue. Players looked at Assassination, which had a clear identity, they looked at Combat, which had a clear identity, then they looked at Subtlety, which required you to repeatedly vanish during active combat, like some kind of anxious magician who keeps disappearing behind his own curtain, and they said, "I'm good, thanks." You could link damage meters all day long, didn't matter, the vibe was off, and in an MMO, vibes are half the battle. The community never asked for stealth dancing, they never asked for a spec that required buff tracking mechanics more complex than some healer rotations. Blizzard built something mechanically ambitious, genuinely creative even, and delivered it to an audience that wanted to stab things from behind, not phase in and out of reality while doing advanced calculus. The gap between what Subtlety demanded and what rogue players actually wanted to be doing was enormous. The Subtlety could perform. That was never really the issue. The issue was that performing required you to play a completely different game than every other rogue spec, and most people would rather just play Assassination and actually enjoy themselves. Can't really blame them. But at least Subtlety's identity crisis was self-contained. Frost Mage managed to get exiled from an entire game mode. Wrath of the Lich King Frost Mage PvE. Here's the thing about Frost Mage in Wrath of the Lich King. Most of the specs on this list ended up terrible by accident. Bad tuning, broken abilities, developers forgetting a class existed for 6 months. Frost Mage is different. Frost Mage was bad on purpose. Blizzard looked at the Mage class, decided Arcane would be the raid spec, Fire would be the big crit spec, and Frost would be the PvP spec, and then they just committed to that fully. The official class overview described Frost as likely the least PvE-oriented specialization, which is a polite way of saying, please don't bring this to our raid. They built a PvP race car and then acted confused when it couldn't compete on a NASCAR track. The talent tree was where the real damage happened. Frost's talents were split between crowd control abilities that made you a nightmare in arenas and damage abilities that made you functional in dungeons, but you couldn't have both. Not enough points. You either built for PvP and accepted that your raid damage would be embarrassing, or you built for PvE and gave up every tool that made Frost Mage feel like Frost Mage in the first place. It was like being handed a menu where every option comes with food poisoning, and raid leaders noticed immediately. The community consensus on Frost Mage rating crystallized into 5 words that every Frost Mage heard at least once a week. Go Arcane or GTFO. That wasn't just sweaty min-maxers talking. Even casual raid groups, the ones running Naxxramas on a Tuesday night with half the roster eating dinner during trash pulls, even they'd whisper you asking if you could please just respect. Arcane mages were pulling dramatically higher numbers, Fire mages were pulling dramatically higher numbers, Frost mages were pulling dramatically higher repair bills from dying to mechanics they couldn't burn through fast enough. Tier lists during Wrath's peak consistently placed Frost Mage in B tier, which sounds acceptable until you realize Arcane and Fire were both sitting comfortably in S tier. You weren't just worse than other classes, you were worse than the other 2 versions of your own class. That's a special kind of humiliation. It's like losing a family talent show to both of your siblings, and then your mom asks if you've considered a different hobby. Blizzard did try to fix it. Patches rolled out attempting to bump Frost's damage numbers while keeping the PvP identity intact. The result was an awkward hybrid that made nobody happy. PvP players felt their spec was being diluted with PvE concessions that didn't fit the playstyle. PvE players looked at the buffed numbers, compared them to Arcane, and went right back to respexing. The patches created a spec that was slightly less terrible at raiding while being slightly less focused in PvP. A compromise that compromised everything. The fundamental problem was never the numbers, it was the philosophy. Blizzard deliberately designed a specialization for one game mode and then released it into an ecosystem where 90% of players evaluated specs based on an entirely different game mode. Frost Mage wasn't broken, it was just built for a building that most players never walked into. But if you think being being intentionally designed for the wrong content is bad, wait until you hear about the spec that got redesigned for content it had already been doing and somehow got worse at it. Burning Crusade Survival Hunter. Survival Hunter and Burning Crusade might be the most selfless spec in World of Warcraft history, and I don't mean that as a compliment. I mean it in the way that a guy who donates both kidneys is selfless. Technically admirable. Functionally, a disaster. Here's the thing. Survival Hunter wasn't designed to kill things. It was designed to help other people kill things. The entire spec was built around utility, trap placement, debuff application, and making sure everyone else in your raid had a slightly better time. Your job wasn't to top the meters, your job was to exist near the meters and feel grateful for the opportunity. The crown jewel of this design philosophy was expose weakness. This ability scaled off your agility and provided an attack power buff to your entire party whenever you critically hit. Technically, you benefited from it too, but the real value was what it did for everyone else. You stacked agility, you invested gear into making expose weakness as powerful as possible, and the primary return on that investment was buffing the rogue and warrior standing next to you. You were essentially a walking aura, a very expensive, slightly also buffed, but mostly there for others walking aura. The rest of the toolkit followed the same logic. Surefooted gave you 3% hit rating, which was genuinely useful, but it existed alongside a kit that emphasized trap placement and debuff application rather than meaningful damage. So your rotation wasn't about maximizing your own output, it was about keeping traps down, maintaining debuffs, and watching the Beast Mastery Hunter in your raid pull ahead on the meters while benefiting from the buffs you were providing him. Which is, not ideal. Raid leaders understood this dynamic perfectly. You didn't bring a survival hunter because you needed DPS, you brought one because you needed the debuffs and somebody had to do it. The spec existed in this weird limbo where it was technically valuable but never actually wanted, like being invited to a party specifically because you own a truck and someone needs to move a couch. But here's where it gets complicated. By the end of Burning Crusade, Survival Hunter actually climbed to S tier on DPS rankings, right alongside Beast Mastery, pulling nearly identical numbers. The gap that people assumed was massive turned out to be razor thin once gear scaling kicked in and players optimized around the spec's strengths. On paper, Survival Hunter had one of the better redemption arcs in the expansion. On paper, because the stigma never went away. It didn't matter that the numbers said S tier. The community had already decided what Survival Hunter was, the buff bot, the hunter who couldn't hack it as Beast Mastery. Raid leaders who'd spent months treating survival as the optional utility slot didn't suddenly start fighting over survival applications just because a tier list updated. The damage was done, and no amount of late expansion number crunching could undo an entire expansion's worth of being treated like a party favor. Survival Hunter in Burning Crusade is the story of a spec that did everything asked of it and got zero credit. You buffed your party, you placed your traps, you applied your debuffs, and at the end of the night, the combat log told a story the community refused to read. The numbers were competitive with the best hunters in the game, and nobody cared. But if you think being a selfless support disguised as a DPS is bad, wait until you hear about the spec that got rejected from groups so consistently it became a community meme. Vanilla Retribution Paladin. Every spec we've talked about today had problems. Some had bad rotations, some had identity crises, some got nerfed into the ground by developers who panicked, but none of them achieved what Retribution Paladin achieved in vanilla. This spec wasn't just bad, it was so bad that a video of it working at all became famous. Let me say that again. A player recorded themselves killing elite monsters in Eastern Plaguelands as a Retribution Paladin, and the community treated it like a moon landing. Not because the kills were impressive, not because the player was exceptional, but because the spec was functioning. That was the bar. It works was historically significant. Here's why. Retribution's entire damage rotation revolved around seal twisting, a mechanic that required you to rapidly swap between Seal of Command, Seal of the Crusader, and Seal of Righteousness in precise timing sequences to trigger proc effects. Sounds complex, sounds like it rewards skilled play. It didn't. The whole system was entirely RNG dependent. You either got all the procs to line up and dealt average damage, or you missed a single twist and plummeted to the absolute bottom of the meter meters. Perfect execution gave you mediocre results. One mistake gave you nothing. But wait, it gets better. Even if you nailed every twist, even if the RNG god smiled upon you personally, your mana ran out in about 30 seconds. Most raid boss fights lasted several minutes. So the spec's optimal rotation was literally unsustainable. You'd burn through your entire mana pool doing average damage, and then you'd just stand there auto-attacking like a very sad scarecrow with a two-handed mace. The community response was brutal. Raid leaders didn't just prefer other specs over Retribution, they considered it unsuitable for any damage roll whatsoever. If you applied to a raid as Ret, you got one of two responses: respec Holy or nothing at all. And the most devastating part, Holy Paladins, the healing spec, occasionally outdamaged Retribution Paladins while healing. A healer doing their healing job would look over at the damage meters and see themselves above the guy whose entire purpose was damage, which is, not ideal. So what did Ret Paladins do? They formed their own groups. Seriously. Rather than subject themselves to endless rejection, Retribution Paladins built their own raid communities, entire guilds of outcasts who looked at the worst spec in the game and said, yeah, but it's my spec. They knew the numbers were terrible. They knew their mana lasted about as long as a sneeze. They didn't care. And honestly, that might be the most impressive thing in this entire video. Not the specs that got buffed, not the ones that got redesigned, the Retribution Paladins who refused to respect during the darkest era of class balance in WoW history and just kept swinging. They cleared content on hard mode by default, and they waited expansion after expansion, patch after patch, until Blizzard finally figured out how to make the spec work. It took years, but Retribution Paladin eventually became not just viable, but genuinely powerful. And every single one of those stubborn players who stuck it out through vanilla earned something no tier set could ever provide: the right to say, I was here when it was terrible and I never left. So here's to the Ret Paladins, the ones who mained the worst spec in WoW history and lived to tell about it. You absolute legends. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, click the video on the screen now.